Disciple makers, and thank you for joining us. The Georgia Baptist Mission Board Discipleship Team, led by Scott Sullivan, exists to help churches take the next step toward becoming a church. We've developed tools to help you, like the Watershed Principle, which identifies 6 main ministries needed to be a healthy church. The Spark Conference, a total church strengthening event that allows you to access keynotes and song for ongoing training in your ministry area. Access it today at thesparkconference.com. We're also setting up learning communities across Georgia to sharpen, encourage, and resource leaders personally and professionally. Find a community near you at GA Baptist. Forget you can find our previous episodes on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and your favorite podcast platform. Now let's join today's broadcast.
Dr. Jody Dean and Dr. Adam Hughes, who have co-authored a book. It's called We Lead, Integrating Church Leadership and Success. Now, they have found this sweet spot between leading and that is so good, man, because you and I have talked about this before. Every one of us as a leader gets to that point in ministry where we got to make a decision. Are we going to stay? And when we do, we're staying out of a calling, not because it's comfortable. I commented yesterday when I was in Petal, Mississippi, that I think the greatest addiction in the world is not drugs or alcohol or pornography. I think it's comfort. Ooh. We're addicted to comfort. And this is not a comfortable time. My goodness, that's just good. That's like a tall glass of cookies kind of good. So Adam, tell me about what was your motivation when you were coming in on this project and working with Jody to create the book?
Yeah, that's a great question, Scott. And I'm glad we started off this way. And I'm going to say some things. And when I said I've written other books or the other literature that's out there, it's just kind of what we saw. And Jody's exactly right. First of all, let me kind of begin where he ended with the concept of calling, where at these leadership books and even these administration books, which, by the way, most of them are 2 separate disciplines, and the books are written that way. They're written separately. But most of them don't really begin with this biblical theological foundation of calling that then works itself out for these leadership principles and these systems of administration. And one of the things is we wanted to begin with this concept of calling because everything flows from there. And we just hadn't seen that done. I'm going to use the word intentionally built on in a lot of the literature. So when the listeners or the viewers see the book, when it releases, what they're going to notice is in some ways, we really don't have an introduction. Our introduction is chapter 1, which is the chapter on calling. And it's what he just said. But beyond that, let me back up just a little bit here, and I'll kind of try to make this quick because I know we need to move on. But Jody's exactly right. It really originated. He and I had taught this class, Church Leadership and Administration, that integration together for about 3 or 4 years. And every time we taught it, we would have kind of a pre-semester and a post-semester review on what worked well. And it seemed like we were constantly revising. And we were like, man, this really isn't found in the literature. It's not found in the literature this way. And really, the books we were using, 2 really good books, but they were just that. They were 2 completely. We said, you know what? Not only are we revising our content, but we don't see this integration. And so what if we tried to write a book that truly integrates? It's not just part 2 on administration, but it integrates because most people's ministry, whether they're a senior pastor, a second chair leader, or even they're a leader of a parachurch ministry, they're regularly, I mean like 5 to 7 days a week, having to engage both of those things. Yes. And so we tried to start a project from beginning to end that thought about taking leadership, calling, and philosophy and some very practical ministries, but at every turn, bringing in the systems and the man to be able to actually lead out and actually perform in such a way to where their leadership wouldn't get shipwrecked. And we thought that would be very helpful for this class. But the more we thought about that, the more we kind of, if I can say, fleshed out these ideas, we realized, you know what, this is going to be really beneficial beyond the classroom, but to those in the local church and in parachurch ministries as well. So why don't we go ahead and broaden our thought on this and make it available to them as well? But that was really the motivation. It started with the class, looking and seeing what was out there. And by the way, the books we were using were 15, 20 years old anyway. Right. And just needing to update that because a lot's changed. And then figuring out how to get a genuine integration. And I don't know if we've done it or not, but that's certainly what we've attempted to do. And that was our motivation.
Well, I've read the manuscript and it is good. And let me double click on something that you said, because 90% of the people who are going to listen or watch this broadcast are not going to be in your seminary class. And we know you're going to use it for classes. They'll do reports and they're going to read it and that sort of thing. But is it written in such a way that Billy at the lube shop, who's part-time at Dirt Road Baptist Church, can read it and have some practical nuggets that he can sink his teeth into?
I absolutely believe, I'll say this, and then Jody, you certainly please add in whatever your perspective is on this. I think we've absolutely written it that way. As a matter of fact, we intentionally built in some components that would engage living that life and doing that ministry. Now, a lot of our chapters have reflection questions to think back over what they've read. Several of our chapters have some very practical case studies to help take all the concepts that we've dealt with in the chapter and actually immediately put it into place. So I think it's very user-friendly and accessible, but I also think it's built in such a way where they can immediately begin to think about practical application as well. That's my thought, and that was our intent in writing it.
Super.
Because even we're thinking about where our students are going to be beyond the classroom, and that's going to be the local church. That's going to be on the mission field. And so we wrote the book in such a way that everybody could have discussions. We didn't want it to just be a book you could read solo, which you could do and really glean a lot from it and to do the self-reflection questions. But it's great to read it with a team. Maybe it's your chairman of deacons. Maybe it's even your custodian or your small group leaders, that people would also understand where you're coming from as the minister. So many people I'm talking to during the pandemic, especially, they have no idea the pressure the ministry week in and week out. You know, they've done funeral after funeral. They've made decision after decision. I told my church yesterday that if we keep having to make alternative plans, we're going to have to start using the Greek alphabet, because we were going to have exhausted our normal operating A through Z, right? We're going to be like the Hurricane Center and have to go to the Greek alphabet because we're out of storm names. And so people still operating under COVID, but I mean, we're well beyond COVID as far as an initial reality. So the book is written in such a way that a couple of guys could sharpen one another. An intergenerational team could sharpen one another, and you could hear from their years of experience in the local church versus your 5 years of experience in the local church, and see how could you sharpen one another. What are those different perspectives, and make sense of all of that. What's in the church, as great and as faithful as they have been, there's a lot to the family and workflow today that is different than what they experienced. And so we see some of that going, well, we don't understand the pastor's schedule. We don't understand the pastor's office hours or the rhythm to his work. So we hope it also brings understanding beyond just the pastor's seat, the associate pastor's seat, the youth, children, all the different perspectives in the church, to the structure and the organization beyond just those that are primary in leadership too.
Jody, Adam, I see this in three different ways, and then I'm going to turn the page on this question. Sure. One is obviously the leaders can read the book and they can digest the information for themselves. If they have questions, they can email you, and we'll put some links down there in the show notes. But another way that I see people can do this, I really think it will be important for leaders in the church to read it and digest portions with other leaders in the church. And that could be lay leaders. That could be, if you're blessed to have a paid staff, I think that's a great way that they can read it, do sections, talk about it in person. But in Georgia here, we've got learning communities set up. We have a little over 40 now, learning communities with 250 leaders meeting in Georgia every month or every other month. And that's why they meet. They'll meet together and they'll talk about these issues. So this is a resource that a learning community could get, read, digest, talk through that, and even have, hey, when we come back next month, let's talk about this. And why don't we all bring back what we're doing in this particular area? Really good stuff. Now, Adam, let me shift over here and go to a second question, because I was listening to a John Maxwell podcast. He was on with another guy, and he threw out that most famous quote that we've all heard that says, everything rises and falls on leadership. Absolutely agree with that. But this is a piece of the book that I think is huge. How important is leadership in the ministry settings for this holistic spiritual formation idea that we're talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I do think that's a major component, at least, that underlies the book. So the first thing I would say is, whether we realize it or not, what we say from the pulpit or our platform, the things that we emphasize, that which our people hear us say, if I can say it another way, that which they see us lead in, whether we explicitly say so or not, those are the things that they're going to think we believe is important. So we're leading in that way, whether we're intentionally, and I'll come back to that in a moment, we are leading in that way. And so there's an old, I majored in college, and there's an old communication axiom that says you cannot not communicate. Now, that's a double negative. We're not supposed to use it, but I think it communicates the point. I think the same is true with leader. A leader cannot not lead.
Yes.
If you are a leader, you're going to lead. And so the question becomes, there's going to be a combination. There's different combinations of the way you lead, right, Scott? Like, so you can either lead unintentionally, and a lot of times when you lead aren't where you want to go because you've not thought through it. It's not been intentional. Or you can be very intentional, strategic, and have a plan with your leadership, and it has a much better chance of a success rate. And so one of the things that we've done in this book is to hopefully key on those areas that will help you be intentional and plan with your leadership so that you can have a higher success rate. Now, let me talk about the second part of your question. How important is that for what we would say in ministry or in the church for holistic spiritual formation? I think both on an individual Christian level, but also on a corporate church level, it is radically important. We've said stuff before like, your people will never be more evangelistic than you are as the pastor or leader or whatever. And I think that's true. But I also think it's true, are your people going to grow beyond where you are spiritually and what you think is important spiritually beyond what the leader does? And I also think it's true that they won't do that. There's a very important case study in God's word that comes to mind when I think about this. And believe it or not, it's the church in Antioch in Acts chapter 11, about verses 19 through 26. And I won't spend time going through all of that, but most of our listeners will remember the story. It's not the church in Jerusalem, it's the church in Antioch where this amazing discipleship movement begins to take place. Barnabas comes down, sees it, it's happening amongst the Jews and the Greeks. He stays there, realizes he needs some help, goes and finds Saul, brings him back, and for an entire year, they meet together, they do ministry together, they preach, they disciple the church. And verse 25 and 26 tells us that it was there in Antioch that the disciples were first called Christians. Mm-hmm. And that would be significant enough, right? Here's this guy, this leader, intentionally leading with a plan towards discipleship. And what does it lead to? Holistic spiritual formation amongst these individuals. But fast forward 2 chapters. Here's what I think is so fantastic. We often don't connect the dots of what happens in chapter 11 to chapter 13. But think about this for just a moment. When the first missionary enterprise that's recorded for us in Acts on a large scale is about to happen, it's again not back to the church in Jerusalem where it happens. We pick back up in chapter 13, verse 1, and it's that church in Antioch again. And now you don't just have Barnabas and Saul mentioned as leaders, you have a list of other leaders that are mentioned there that are leading with them, that are praying together and they're fasting. And the implication of the context is these leaders in this church weren't brought in from the outside. They were raised up from the inside. Spiritual formation happened. But then what happens to the church as a whole? They catch through all of these leaders' leadership functioning right within these systems, the mission of God. And out of that, they anoint, lay hands on, and commission Paul and Barnabas to go on the first missionary journey. It's not to preach a sermon to you, but I am a preacher. But all that to say, I think it's vitally important. And there's no way it won't have an effect, either positive intentionally or negative unintentionally, on the church's holistic spiritual formation.
That's great. And Jody, I want to pitch the same question to you, but Adam was dealing with leadership. And let's just be honest. Leadership books, leadership topics, they're what I call sexy. That's people want to absorb that. They want to read that. We want to talk about leadership. But when we talk about administration, you and I know from 30 years of local church ministry that I know that if I don't do administration well, then ministry doesn't happen. Then my preaching doesn't go well. So the administration part of this has to go well, and we've got to spend some time. So how important is that for the holistic spiritual formation side?
Thanks, Scott. I think it's important because if we're not careful, we focus so much on being sure we're the right leader that we forget to lead where we're planted in the ministry setting that God has placed us. And so it's important for us to think about like managing our workflow. And what I mean by that is you've got only so many blocks of time in a day, morning, afternoon, evening, night. You've got 4 blocks. You've got 7 days in the week. And so you're going to need some blocks with your family. You're going to need a block or two for rest. If you're like me, you need a little nap here or there. You're going to need some blocks, but there's some blocks that are just determined that are going to be ministry. And so what are you going to do to make those the most effective they can be? And so if you've got to do hospital visits and you've got to manage the ministries that are happening in the church, and every church, no matter what size they are, has got a few ministries going on. They've got some type of group, Sunday school, small group ministry. They've got worship service. They're going to have some other ministries for age-graded ministry as well as adults to move through some type of discipleship system. So there alone, you're at 3 different ministries, and we've not talked about deacon ministry, bereavement ministry, other types of ministry that you could have, men, women ministry, move all. So even in the smaller church setting, sometimes we think, oh, that's just for the large church. No, that's for any size church. Managing the work is going to be key. And so as you look at that, what type structure do you have in place then to effectively lead? And I'm finding more and more people do not even know the structure of the church. It's this gentleman over here. He's got 50 years of intellectual knowledge of the church because he's been a part of it. So in his mind, he has it perceived one way, but he doesn't even line up with the structure of the church, how it's documented. Yeah. Because it's morphed over time in his mind to how he thinks it should be.
Yeah. That's
what he's been conditioned to think about church. And then you've got younger people coming in and go, why do we even need a structure? And then you've got people with years of experience in life that are like, well, my business has this type structure and I think it's effective. And so what's happened a lot of times in administration is, as great as our lay people have been, our pastor comes from a God-given vision for leadership, but we've not given the same work toward administration, even though it's one of the gifts listed in the New Testament. And so because we've not given as much attention, we've got whatever worked at the bank that got brought to the church because that president of the bank was on our finance team, or this CPA was a deacon in our church, or this person owned a small business that had been successful and a pillar of the community and had a lot of good community service. So our administrative systems, Scott, then what they did is they just became, oh, we'll do it the world's way. We'll do it whatever was effective in business. And we'll use those same standards now to judge our ministry leaders, to judge our pastor. So if you're not at the office on time at 8 a.m., you're just not effective. They don't realize that you might have been at 5 a.m. at the hospital praying with somebody before surgery. So then you go home and eat breakfast and then go to the office at 9. You know, it's those type of rhythms to where not everything that worked at the medical clinic or at the bank or at the farm supply, whatever it may be in your town, doesn't always carry over to how we administer the work of the church. Yeah. And so we're trying to help you make sense of what that might look like from a Christian perspective, going back to exactly what Adam said, trying to lay that biblical foundation to where there are some models here and some rhythms that we find in the Bible that help us lead well while administering the work.
That's it. And Jody, you alluded to something that I want to emphasize, that no matter where you are in your leadership journey, if you're at the small church, the medium church, or maybe you're at the largest church in the world, there is still administration that has to happen. You can't hire somebody to do everything for you. I love Michael Catt, retired pastor now at Sherwood Church, had a quote that said, God doesn't expect you to just lean on a shovel and then pray for a hole. The point being that we got to work. Yeah, there's work to do no matter where you are and what capacity. In this administration piece that you wrote on is great. Now let's land the plane here. Got one final question for you, and we'll it's kind of a lightning round. Give you 90 seconds each to deal with this. but you deal with ministry conflict in the book. And oh my goodness, is that timely? Because listen, we're seeing that a lot of our churches were grace-filled in those, first 15 months of the pandemic. And now we're at this point, and it's like people are saying, hey, let's let chaos reign. Let's go after the pastor. Let's start throwing bullets during this and make his life even more uncomfortable and difficult. And I remember in Houghton, we had a moment when we had to call the police because one of our most trusted leaders, maybe the most trusted leader, was caught videoing some of our girls with a secret camera in a bathroom at a retreat. And listen, we weren't prepared for that. Sure. We weren't prepared how to handle that, what to do, where to go from that. So let me just throw a question. We'll start, Adam, with you. What are some keys to leading through conflict in these uncharted territories that you may mention to our leaders that are listening, engaging today?
Yeah, like you said, Scott, I'll try to be very, very quick here. So one of the things I would say, I think you're exactly right. It's timely because we're in the first part, there was this grace and understanding in the church because of COVID, but now we're 18 months to 2 years in, and it's kind of like we're past that now, and we're hearing all these stories. So let me just mention 2 or 3 things as far as principles go, and then I'll quickly dig in on a couple that I think are really, really important. I think number one, there needs to be an understanding that you actually have to define the problem. A lot of times we don't actually even know what the problem is that we're dealing with because these emotions go high. I'm actually dealing more with my emotions or more that I'm wanting to win than I actually know what the actual conflict that we need to resolve is. So that's one thing I would say is we as leaders, we just have to help the church really, really, really understand what are the parameters of the problem, and we have agreement there. The other thing I would say is at some point, whether it's from day one or day 100, they're going to need to hear, your people are going to need to hear from a voice other than just the primary leader. There's going to need to be some kind of coalition, but the people that they need to hear from that are involved in that, they need to be the right people. And the right people for this problem might not be the right people from the problem that you had to solve before. And so you have to have some wisdom in knowing who that is. And then 2 things that I just really, really wanted, there's so many more things I could say, but those are some things I would say. The other thing I would say is we have to get to the point where we can engage in what I call collaborative conflict resolution or collaborative problem solving. I don't think this idea is original with me, but I also don't think we do it well. So here's what happens, and this happens between most human conflicts, whether it's interpersonal in the home or more corporate in the church. We begin to form sides and we think the goal is to win. The goal is not to win. And a matter of fact, the other side or the other person's not your enemy. What you're trying to do is you're trying to fix the problem. And you've got to get to the point where both sides are understanding we have a common goal, and that's to reach a solution to the problem. Now, that's hard to do, really hard to do when the emotions are running high. So as the leader, you've got to be wise enough sometimes to say, we're going to stop right now. We're going to pray. I'm not going to even continue to have this conversation. We're going to set a time and we're going to come back when the emotions have died down so that we can work together. And we can understand we're a team we're going to lay the problem on the table as an artifact. That's how I talk about it. And we're going to work together on the artifact, not against each other. And then the final thing I would say, because I know I'm out of time and I'll kick it to Jody, is the other thing that we have to do is we can't just have the meeting, come up with a solution, wring our hands and say we're done. There's got to be a circling back around at some time for ongoing evaluation, and we've got to ask the question. And we can't be afraid to ask the question, have we actually resolved the problem now? Have we actually resolved it? Or do we still need to make some adjustments, go back to the drawing board, implement something else, and then go back to work on it? So those would be my thoughts as we think about any conflict, but certainly as it relates to COVID.
Fantastic, Adam. Jody?
I think it's also important for us, following up with, as Adam said, the last chapter of the book goes with risk management, just exploring the risk in the local church following conflict. And I think in both of those, one word that is usually far from our vocabulary is consistency, because we're living in the reality of the urgent. And so with COVID especially, and so we make one decision 6 months ago because we're going to cancel this event because there's a surge. We're going to cancel this event because it could be a spreader event. But now we lost so much momentum in the church. We're like, I'm sick of canceling. I'm not going to cancel anymore. And you got deacons that went, hold up, I backed you. What happened to the same policy? And so consistent leadership is going to be the key here. If you've not been consistent in how you make decisions up until this point, your people are going to be frustrated because just like some of our government leaders have not been consistent, or maybe you don't even think the CDC's been consistent, to not be consistent in how you've made decisions, or not bringing people along to let them know how you're making those decisions. So I would start with, in this case, Scott, are you consulting local Christian medical providers in how you approach decision making for best practices? It's not going to be ideal, but for best practices. The other aspect that I would encourage pastors, ministers, volunteers, anyone to consider in this is, we were not designed to go 2 years navigating the unknown. So it's not always going to make sense. And if it hasn't made sense in your kid's school, and it's not made sense at your place of employment, then why would you expect it to make sense also at church? We see conflict throughout the New Testament where things didn't make sense to different groups of people. So don't make this political. Make this about, I want to love my neighbor. And so what does it mean to really love your neighbor? And so I have found too in the local church to where people thought this didn't matter to them in the beginning. They now had a family member that's been sick, and now it matters. So they're wearing a mask without us telling them they might want to. We have people that are now choosing to socially distance because they want to be there, because they're designed for community by their creator, Holy God, but they've missed it. And so you have multiple emotions coming, as well as you have people that are like, I did all that, I don't want to have to go back and do it again. Because they're still dealing with the mental and physical and emotional weight of that. I had COVID last November, Scott. Darkest days of my life, sickest I've ever been in my life. And today, coming up the stairs to my office, I just, my heart rate was racing, and I just didn't have breath by the top of the stairs wearing a mask. I get it's frustrating. Yeah. But I can't forget that when I walk in the door of the church, even though my heart rate's up and I'm out of breath wearing a mask, that I don't love my brother, Scott. I still have the same love for Scott. And if I'm over here and Adam's my neighbor, and I hadn't talked to Adam as a human being and even shared Christ with him for 18 months in a pandemic to let him know Jesus loves him, then why should I expect church people to come together and be the body of Christ?
That's good. That's good.
So I think, we said earlier in this episode that, hey, it rises and falls on leadership. So our calm demeanor, am I going to love people as Christ loved me? Am I going to show them that grace by wearing a mask? Am I show them that grace by moving over in my seat a little bit? Am I going to give my pastor a little grace and going, you know what? He's done more funerals than he's probably done in a year. He's probably had to mask up, glove up, and even sometimes quarantine from his own family by ministering to the people. So, you know what? I'm going to give him some grace. I'm going to give him some grace. And if you think this is a time to pile on everything you didn't like because you started listening online to a ton of preachers, and so now you're going to start judging his ability based on what you're seeing other people do, well, that's not a biblical model. It's within the local body. It's not external. And so within the local body, is there anything that doesn't line up with the biblical model of a leader? And I think you're going to find that, you know what, you got to give leaders a little grace. Paul didn't get it right all the time. Timothy did not get it right all the time. John did not get it right all the time. And so as you keep going down the list, did Peter get it right all the time? No. But were they willing to keep showing up? Yeah. Were they willing to admit, I may not have all the answers? And were they willing to say, Lord, we need you to show us the way? And so I think a little humility might go a little way for the leader.
Yeah, and I will say this. I think you guys got it right with this book. So tell us about when it's coming out.
So we're releasing a soft launch end of August, and it's going to be available in September. New Hope Publishers is going to be the ones putting it forward, and we're thankful to work with them and Iron Stream Media out of Birmingham, Alabama, and great partners in the ministry. Love their work and great people. And so we're just humbled that we get to even lean in a little bit with a resource that could help you navigate an issue, further your leadership, or actually manage the work at a higher level. And hopefully it'll help some people reduce their conflict, spend more time with the things they love and the calling they have, and just increase their biblical foundation for those areas.
Well, we'll try to make sure we put links to how folks can find the book, also to y'all's contact if they want follow-up information, because you guys are fantastic speakers and conference leaders if folks are interested in that. So thanks so much, Dr. Jody Dean, Dr. Adam Hughes, for being with us, providing a great resource. And listen, friends, of those who are watching, I read an article this week about the Mona Lisa when it was stolen several years ago from the Louvre Museum, and it was missing for 2 years. And the article mentioned that more people came to see where the Mona Lisa used to be during that 2-year period than they did the 12 years prior that it actually hung in the Louvre. Friends, listen to me. Let's set priorities and spend time on leadership and on administration, doing things that we know we need to do. Let's do it now while we can. Let's not wait until there's a conflict, until there's more stress and more anxiety to start dealing with this. You can be ahead of the game. Producer Ray Sullivan, my Southeast discipleship consultant, Georgia Baptist Mission Board, thank you for producing this for us as well. And friends, we hope and we pray for you every day as we do. That's why we exist. And we want you to take every opportunity to grow as a leader, and let's go make world impacting disciple makers.
Amen.
Thanks for listening. We want to continue the conversation from today's broadcast in a learning community near you. These learning communities are designed to celebrate your biggest wins, resource your greatest need, and help you finish well. We also want to give you a free gift, the 5 discipleship shifts most churches need to make to produce world-impacting disciple makers. You can download this resource by going to ministryboom.com. This 5-page PDF is a discipleship alignment checklist. The Georgia Baptist Mission Board is able to provide resources like this because of gifts from Georgia Baptists to the cooperative program. For more information on this broadcast and a customized discipleship plan for your church, visit gabaptist.org/discipleship. Engage with us on your time through Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and all podcast platforms. Lastly, if you've benefited from this conversation today, please share this with a friend as we seek to help churches make world-impacting disciple makers.